Oh, yeah. You're listening to the Justin Lascek podcast. And thank you so much for tuning in for episode 2. That's Bobby Emmett. That's one of his songs in the intro. He also mixed the last episode. So thank you, Bobby. And thank you for all the support you guys have given me on social media. I really appreciate it. I can't respond to everybody, and I think we'll find out a little bit about the emotional well-being of why that is, because I usually have to choose to take care of myself, and I wish I could say thank you to everybody, but this is my way of doing it, so thank you so much. This episode is going to be a little different because the previous one, I wrote it out, it was scripted. I wanted to get everything in the intro so that everyone could understand where I was coming from, but this one's going to be a little ad-libbed, and I've never done this, so quite frankly, I'm fucking terrified. And I've done a lot of terrifying things that normal people would consider terrifying. When you stand on the ramp at 13,000 feet ready to jump out to do some skydiving, and you tell yourself, or specifically I told myself, I'm not scared because I just compartmentalized everything in my life. And you look down at the ground 13,000 feet away, and then I personally would just compartmentalize that fear and use some breathing regulation and jump. And the same thing happened in combat. If I was supposed to go move to a particular building with a bunch of partner force and some Americans, and nobody wanted to move, and the partner force didn't want to move, I would step off. And they follow leadership and strength, and so I would just do those things. And so I have a long history of compartmentalizing fear, and now at this point in my life, I'm allowing myself to feel it, and it's pretty scary. So that's me being open with you guys, a little vulnerable, I guess. But we'll get through this because I'm sick of doing cuts for this. I've done a multiple intro takes, but let's just rock and roll. So I think the reason I wanted to do this podcast is because I've done a lot of development in my life and a lot of thinking, and it's difficult being in this position and everybody responding to on social media to what your condition is. And for anybody that doesn't know, I was pretty much nearly killed in combat in March of 2019, and it's a little over a year, and I've gone through a lot of ups and downs. I had both my lower legs amputated and went through a lot of surgeries and a lot of recovery and had a decently quick recovery, and I've been managing my emotional health since. So that's where the framework of all this is. And I've gone through a lot, and I try and contemplate why I'm here and what I want out of this life. And before that second deployment, after my first, I'll get into this in a little bit, but I went through a period of trying to figure out what I wanted to do in my life. If I wanted to get out of the Army, if I wanted to go to another selection. So if you're a little unknowing about the military, another selection would push me up to another unit if I were to be selected. I was already in a special operations unit, but I just didn't know what I wanted to do, and I really liked combat, and I just wanted to go back. But what I did know is that when I did get out of the Army, because it wasn't a forever thing for me, that I wanted to help people, because that's what I've always done with my company, 70s Big, in the past, which is relatively dormant now. And I don't really do a good job of making money because I just want to help people. And when people call you a hero as a result of your circumstance, and you know, like I know how I feel inside and how I don't identify as a hero, and I have a lot of things that I regret in my past, and I deal with a lot of self-hate. So being called a hero it's kind of like if only you knew, or if only your kids knew what goes on inside my mind. And that was something that was very difficult for me to deal with at the 1-year mark of the injury. But after a lot of contemplation and discussing things with people I care about, and the conclusion is that this is a platform for me to reach as many people as possible to try to make things better. And that's all I really care about. So all of this particular episode stems from an existential crisis. It's very, very weird. And it has to do with the circumstance. So we're in the middle. This is mid-April right now in 2020. So this is the middle of the COVID peak. It seems to be peaking more in the United States. And for most people, they may not be affected directly by the virus and not have symptoms, but they're quarantined and self-isolated at home, and they have a lot of time on their hands because they can't conduct their normal activities of daily living. They can't go to work, or they might be working from home. And so people are kind of like left to their own devices. And social media is a weird ass thing. I kind of hate it, but I'm trying to leverage it in a unique way that to be productive. And there's a lot of people on social media that put out a lot of kind of inflammatory messages. And I would even argue that a certain type of message, like, if you're not coming out of quarantine bettering yourself, then you wasted your time. And that's essentially a shame-based argument to try and convince people to do something. And so I don't want to be that at all. And another extension of this existential crisis is motherfucking Tiger King. We watched that show, and man, at the last episode, the 7th one, I cried, like, and I'm trying to figure out why. And I think it's because you see people in the extremes of human life, but a lot of people are dealing with emotional problems, emotional trauma, and then their coping mechanisms and their behaviors culminate into developing a type of personality and a psyche and behaviors that result in them being a certain way. And I know people in my life that in one end of the spectrum that have committed suicide, and I could see the trend of their behaviors and their emotions over time that resulted in that event. And a lot of people, my opinion is that a lot of people aren't aware of what emotional troubles they are encountering, and if they're not aware of it, then they can't work on it. And so that's kind of the premise of this episode. It's also just seeing things on Twitter and seeing people be very inflammatory. I just want to do something to combat against that. And so you have, when people act like that, you have, I kind of reduced it to one of two possibilities. You have that that behavior is something that they developed and they continue to be rewarded with fame, attention, or money. And that's why they keep doing it, because they have essentially a positive reinforcement of things that they might want. And then the other end of the spectrum is that it's all an act just to achieve those things. So is Alex Jones believing the crazy ass shit that he says? I don't know, but like either way, he's getting some sort of reinforcement for it, either because he's getting money and notoriety and relevancy, which is a huge thing. So you see certain musicians are doing work for Rolling Stone, they're writing articles, and then meanwhile, my friend Sturgill is posting about Dick Daddy shit on Instagram and generating it into a way to raise money for relief of COVID and Tennessee tornado victims, which destroyed our bus when we were still on the tour. So it's just like this dichotomy of things that are going on. But either way, that the behavior exists, whether it's because it's just what the person coped with and they got a benefit from it, or they're doing it because they're a slimy piece of shit and they want to have the end state of money, like to sell a book or something. And I don't want to do that. I already told you I'm terrified of doing this episode, but I'm more terrified, and the reason it took me so long to do this is because I'm afraid to lead anyone astray. It's a time of emotional vulnerability for me as an individual, but also just kind of how society and the world is. And I just want to make sure that anybody listening, they know that I don't have any judgment or bias on people. These are the things I might talk about. It's just my nature to synthesize information and try to push it out and to educate in order to try and make things better, because I see things as I see a problem. I see problems in general. It's just how I operate. And then I want to create a more efficient way of doing things. I want to improve upon what exists. I want to improve upon my situation. In the military, we have a term, and that's improve your fighting position. Like, you're never done doing that. If you're in a foxhole, that's, it's better than being just laying on the ground, but you want some like Heskos in front of you, which are these big things we fill with like rocks and shit to either take shrapnel or to prevent bullets from hitting us and so on. So we just always want to improve, and that should be the nature. I think it's part of my general philosophy, which is going to kind of come out in this episode, but of general improvement, but not holding against ourselves if we don't. And so in special operations, specifically Army Special Forces, we have this phrase a lot that is, what are the second and third order effects of your actions? And I'm required to consider those things all the time as a Green Beret, as a dude on a team that's doing things. And so, one of the things that I would ask of anybody is to consider the second and third order effects of what they're doing, regardless of where they are in the government or social media, and the implications of their actions and how it's going to reverberate, whether it's a societal thing or if there are actual actions or people changing their beliefs as a result. So those are the things that I think about. And I'm in a fortunate situation from an unfortunate situation. So like the unfortunate ideology is that I almost died and I got blown up. And then now I'm still active duty. I don't want to be, but just the circumstances of COVID and everything are making it so. But I'm in a fortunate situation as a result of that blast that I have a lot of time to think and write. I write every day, not really for public consumption. It's in my journal, but I see essays and things coming out of it. And that fear I mentioned earlier is why it's not public yet. But I just have a lot of time to think and write, and allowing myself to consider what is going on a general scale or what's going on with me. And then I don't think it's useful just to say, this is what the problem is. This is bad, or I don't like this, or I don't like this about myself, because the overall theme should be, okay, once we work through feeling those things, we should start to understand them, and then we need to create a solution of what we can actually do to influence our situation to make it better. And so the overall way that I look at kind of like a societal thing is that if you boil it down to what can you do to make things better, then I think that those two ideas are critical thinking and compassion. And so the reason I've come to those conclusions, and I'm always like bouncing ideas off of people to see what they personally think and to challenge my own beliefs. But when I look at how things are right now and where they've come from 100 years ago, and how they've improved and how we've had generational changes and things occur by the decade, I think that we have a lot of time to worry. We have the freedom of time and the freedom of circumstance of like quality of life to not have to worry where our next meal is coming from, or to worry about the complete collapse of the economy, or to the complete apocalyptic destruction of the world in the Cold War. And so I think that we're free now with time and circumstance, at least in Western society, to have to deal with our emotions. And I don't think that you inherently learn in society, educational systems, or religion for that matter, to inherently consider those emotions and take care of the self. And so that's where all this stuff is coming from. And when I think about science fiction or something, they always have the world building of the society always entails like either a dystopia or a utopia or something in between. But those glaring examples of in 1984, Alas Babylon, and Fahrenheit 451. So those types of societies are kind of projections of, if things continue, this is what they could be. They're social commentary. So what I would want to see in the end state is maybe not like a spice ruled universe like Dune, but I would want to see the improvement in our society and quality of life improving, and people ultimately improving themselves as individuals. And so that's a very vague and hypothetical end state, but what can happen right now to have reverberations to get to that end state? And so I kind of have maybe a cynical view of things, but maybe an optimistic hope of what can happen, because it kind of seems like everything is predicated on money and power. And people with money and power don't want to do things that will reduce their money and power, and typically they want to only increase those things. So if there were aspects of society that I thought that would challenge money and power, as like if I think that is my opinion, then I don't think it's going to be a top-down change, is my point. I think it's going to be a bottom-up change. And you can't really just flip a switch and have a change in society. It doesn't work like that. I mean, if you look at just the problem of racism has been, a couple hundred years in progress, and then we've had a lot of changes generationally, and then we see a lot of changes with social equality too, especially with other forms of equality in the LGBTQ communities. So, what I would want in my hypothetical end state, which I think most people would if they did like a philosophical experiment considering it, is just like things to be better. Generally, violence to go down. Generally, quality of life to improve across the world, and to there to be more of a peace and harmony type thing. So what I boiled it down to are critical thinking and compassion, and compassion is going to be one of the main themes of. It's just one of the main themes of my personal philosophy, and so it'll come up a lot in this show. And the challenge that I feel like I have is trying to link these almost dichotomous mentalities of mental toughness and compassion. Like, you look at my background, like I had a strength and conditioning company. We lifted weights, taught people how to lift weights, mechanics, anatomy, and physiology. And then I became a special operations soldier. I wish it was shooting guns and lifting weights most of the time, but that's also not what a Green Beret is. Some Green Berets are like that, but our mission set has 9 core missions, and it's primarily foreign internal defense and unconventional warfare. And unconventional warfare is this doctrinal thing that the step-by-step process the end state is to liberate the oppressed, which is our motto, De Oppresso Liber. And so I guess what I'm saying is I have this background that could be a pretty hardcore Tommy Tough guy, and I fucking hate Tommy Tough guy mentality. I hate it. It's not considerate, and it usually has a narrow-minded view of how to accomplish things. So these two opposing mentalities or viewpoints, mental toughness and compassion. The mental toughness, when I think of that, I think about just how I live my life. Gave you the example of jumping, some aspects of combat. I mean, you have to be mentally tough in the situation when you're pinned down by machine gun fire for like 5 minutes, and you can't. You're not really thinking in terms of compassion. You're not thinking in terms of present. You're thinking in terms of the present, not the past or the future when you're in a situation like that. And so you use what I'm kind of calling like a compartmentalization that's resulting in like a fear suppression. And then compassion on the other end is kind of this. Some qualities of it might be self-kindness and empathy for others. It's kind of not really a wartime thing. And society is kind of warlike. Not saying that it's not part of our social history, but things are very divisive. And you're in the group or you're out the group. And so when I think of how people try to put messages out, I think of those second and third order effects. Is it resulting in that mental toughness mentality, which in my lack of academic view is kind of like a reverberation of World War I, II, Cold War? Like, you were happy to have food on your table. Any father who was the head of the household would have been happy to have a can of meat and like a loaf of bread on their table at one point in American history. And so clean your plate, be happy for what you have. And then there was prosperity. And now we're at this point where we have the prosperity. And so I just hope all this is kind of creating a framework for where all this shit is coming from in my head. And it's kind of just a smattering, a shotgun blast in this little intro. But John Adams has a really interesting quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I'm not reading anything, but it generally says, "I must study war and politics so that my sons must study math and engineering so their sons can study art and poetry." And to which I would add, so their sons can fuck around on Instagram, which is okay to fuck around on Instagram. But I just think that there is a responsibility to every individual to try and be the best they can, and then to accept themselves, because that frees them up to be a better functioning member of their little social circle, whether it be family and friends, and then that can reverberate outwards to more of a societal thing. And so I just hope that this emotional framework that we're going to get into is something that might help some people. There are a lot of people that follow my page that, I'm talking about the Instagram page, that are struggling with emotional health. And you guys send me messages all the time, whether some of you have been raped, some of you have lost a loved one to suicide or cancer, some of you have cancer or are paralyzed, some of you you have depression. And I have PTSD. I'm diagnosed with PTSD and major depressive disorder, which is like a treatment-resistant type of depression. And so I just hope that by listening to this, you have kind of a community of like-minded people and something that stimulates your thought on what you might be able to do in the meantime, especially during this COVID stuff. And it's not telling you how to live. It's just giving some suggestions, and then I'll likely improve this framework over time. But I just hope it helps, and that's why we're here. So I think it's important. I kind of gave a little bit about my background, but that's where I'm going to start with this, because there's a lot of stuff that influenced me to get to this point, and I've had to learn about my background in deliberate introspection in order to understand my past and to understand who I am as an individual now, and to know what to do for myself. So as a kid, my parents got divorced when I was pretty young, around 7, and I'm going to not withhold or not kind of tell you all the vulnerable things, but I think looking back, I felt pretty weak and lonely all the time, and I started lifting weights when I was watching wrestling. I may have been like 11 years old, or maybe 12. Started lifting weights because I'd always thought, I want to be big like WWF wrestlers, and which was true, because it's like being big and strong is kind of sweet. But I think I started building kind of an armor to deflect the negative feelings I had, or like the weak feelings, and I never wanted to feel weak. I wanted to be strong. So I started training, and that led through like a high school experience with football. Played a year in college, kind of developed into an adult where I'm implementing essentially like psychological skills training with cognitive behavioral theory type stuff, and then got into running 70s Big, which was associated. It was predicated on that strength training can teach you things about mental toughness, which it certainly can. And then I had a little satire of masculinity, which may be updated nowadays. But then I joined the Army. Went through the Q course. I was like 26, turning 27 when I went to basic training. And then the Special Forces qualification course is we call it the Q course. And that's where all your training occurs. It's changing all the time, but for me to enlist and become a Green Beret was about 3 years. And through that time, it's difficult because you got to put all of your effort in your life into that course in order to be successful. And the same thing applies to being a Green Beret or any special operations personnel, because you put so much effort into getting selected. You put so much effort into the training. If you created a graph that was a circle, and at the center was 0, and on the edge of the circle was 100, and you just created all these attributes, and you, like if shooting's the skill of shooting, which can be broken down into 50 skills by itself. But if shooting were a skill and I scored at an 80 on it, then what would my medical skills be? Would they be like a 99? And then that goes on for everything. We shoot, we move, we communicate, we medicate. But then a Green Beret is so much more. We build rapport with indigenous people. We build rapport with people in our unit, with people that work on our FOBs, with our partner force, with our infantry, our U.S. infantry. So there's just so much that goes into being a Green Beret that the job is never done. And that's the case in the course too, because you can never maximize all of those skills. Let's say there's 100 skills. It's impossible to have a score of 100 in all of those skills. So you want to pour everything into it. And we have this saying in the course is selection never ends. Your reputation we have this negative bias in society. So if you fuck up once, then you're kind of screwed. And it can kind of soil your reputation. So you're always like trying to prove yourself. And especially when you're new, you just want to put everything into it. You want to be the best that you can. And then you tack on the idea that you're going to go to combat. Like, why wouldn't you put your entire life into trying to prepare for a life or death situation that is combat? And I was in a position that when I showed up to a team, we had about a year, and then we were deploying to go to combat. So I had a year of training. And then we went on that first deployment, and there was a fair amount of interesting style combat, a lot of daytime stuff, and been in, if you're familiar with some military terminology, tactic wise, like I was in nearly every battle drill, sometimes in the same firefight, near ambush, sniper, far ambush, all the stuff. All the weapon systems that they had in the area that I was operating in was fired at us, and basically combat's like this extreme form of the human experience, and it's really it's normal for us. And a lot of you that aren't in the military or don't, that your job isn't to be in combat, you may not, you probably won't understand this, and that's okay. But you want to be in combat when you're in that position. You love combat. I loved maneuvering on the enemy. I loved doing it, and I loved leading people in it. And so when you are preparing for something like that your decisions can influence whether you save people or you lose people, then you want to pour everything into it. And if you pour everything into that one thing, where does it leave you as an individual? Where does it leave your family, like a wife or kids? I don't have any kids. I'm divorced, and this played a huge role in that. And so I remember in December of 2017, we had an incident where someone got killed, and I was along with two other very good medics, an 18 Delta and a 68 Whiskey. We treated this individual, and there was nothing that we could do to save him. We did everything we could, but it was a very chaotic, emotional experience for everybody involved. And we had that loss, and I was also in the middle of losing a relationship, and I came home from that deployment essentially in a state of depression, and maybe didn't know it at first, but I determined that, especially when you have a divorce in a relationship that you really care about, and maybe I fucked up a lot of stuff too. So there's a lot of regret, self-hate, sadness, and then I didn't have the appropriate emotional methods of processing that and experiencing it and improving. And so I started reading, I've always read books to try and improve, but I started reading relationship-based books on marriage, and I realized that I needed to improve upon myself as an individual, to be a healthy individual, so that I could show up to be part of a healthy relationship and relationships in general, whether they're with family, friends, or a romantic relationship. And so later in 2018, after that deployment, with a lot of other stuff going on, I finally started journaling. I'd been meditating since 2015, which I highly recommend, but we'll talk about it later. But journaling is a form of deliberate introspection, and so I was working on trying to love the self, and I kind of started getting the foundation for this framework I keep talking about, which is the whole point of this episode. So I was implementing methods of trying to work on gratitude and trying to love the self. Literally Googling, how do I love myself, while crying at the table, and just trying to figure that shit out, while all at the same time preparing for a second combat deployment. I mean, at one point, some of these terms won't really make sense to some of you guys, but I was acting as the team sergeant, the only Delta, which is a medic, and the Fox, which is the intel sergeant. I was functioning as all three of those, with three relatively new guys of the team and a warrant officer, and was working about 80-hour weeks, 80-hour weeks for about 3 or 4 weeks, preparing for a pre-mission training. And so I'm doing all this, dealing with all that, and then trying to manage the job because I'm preparing for combat. And I'm also in a little more of a senior role, which which I enjoy because I get to have an influence on circumstance, and was confident in the preparation of it because I had done it before. And so while I'm working on trying to love the self, then love myself, we deploy. And then a month into it, I step on a bomb. And that was a very, I mean, I've got PTSD, so it's like an intense traumatic experience where I wouldn't say I like completely lose consciousness during the day and like think about it, but I mean, I think about it every day, and I have relived it in that sense, but it still has an effect. And especially when you're, and the thing that might help you understand is that my physical trauma is bonded with my emotional trauma, because there was a point when the dudes were moving me, and that means my dudes, the guys that saved me, and they were moving me to a landing zone, and I was on a lot of ketamine, so there's this change in perception associated with the event too. I was dying, you could feel it, and I was convinced I was going to die, and all I could think about was the shame and regret over the relationship that I felt that I had failed in. And that makes shit makes shit pretty difficult when you have the physical and the emotional trauma, the major traumas of your life, just like completely bonded together. And so then I dealt with the aftermath of that, and being in incredible pain for a very long period of time. Through the time in the hospital, I was an inpatient for 2 months. I went to Germany for about a week, and then got to Walter Reed on mid-March. And when I got there, it was Monday, Wednesday, Fridays surgeries. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And you're just surviving. And to just give you a quick example of one little thing that was just a part of my day for a couple weeks. There's this stuff called Dakin's solution, which is a sodium hypochlorite, which is what bleach is. And so the solution is just a very small amount of sodium hypochlorite, so it's a low-grade bleach solution, but these things called wound vacs. So you take it's all sterile, you get like a sponge and you put it over an open wound, and then you kind of put like a sticky saran wrap over it, so it sticks to, like, it creates a seal on the skin around the wound, and then you put a little suction thing on it and it sucks on it. So that's a wound vac, and what it does is it granulates the tissue to help it heal, and or to pull fluid out, which aids in like reducing or preventing infection, but also granulating the tissue. And in this case, my amputations were not closed. So there's this picture of me on the Instagram page. You'd have to scroll down a little. Where I've got a green beret and sunglasses on, and no legs, and you can see these black things all over my legs. Those are wound vacs. And I'm also extremely edematous, which means extremely swollen and just bloated. Anyway, those wound vacs had a little IV tubing to them, and so what they would do every 4 hours to my recollection, was they would turn the wound vacs off. And by the way, wound vacs are incredibly painful by themselves, because it's literally like you have an open wound and there's something sucking on it. So that thing sucks already. Pun intended. And then they would turn those off and they would infuse the Dakin solution into it. So essentially pouring bleach into open wounds. And they would let it sit for like 5 or 10 minutes. I want to say it was 10. And then at the end of that 10 minutes, they would turn them on. And then the wound vacs, which already are incredibly painful, suck out this incredibly painful bleach solution out of the wounds. And so that happened every 4 hours. I want to say it was at least a week. My memory is kind of weird. I was on about 100 mgs of ketamine an hour, which if anybody right now did 100 mgs of ketamine, like infused over an hour, you'd cruise pretty hardcore, like probably a decent psychedelic experience. And so that was every 4 hours. And then I wouldn't get any pain meds either. Additional pain meds. You get a PCA, which is like you can hit a button and get a certain type of drug, but narcotics don't really do anything for me, it seems like. And then for nerve pain, they don't either. So ketamine was the main thing that is very useful. And ketamine's a great drug. We use it in special operations medicine as a pain adjunct, among other things. And you can't really overdose on it. It doesn't have the same problems as narcotics like hypotension, which is low blood pressure, and you don't like kill someone's respiratory drive with it. If anything, it makes people tachypnic and tachy, which is a high increasing breathing and increasing heart rate. So anyway, ketamine's a great drug, but I was on a lot of it, so my memory's all wonky. But I remember I would have these like very well thought out discussions with doctors, and I'd be like, may I please have some kind of pain drug when you guys put this bleach into my legs, because this is incredibly painful. I finally convinced someone. I assume it was a doc, and from my memory, which may not be the best source, I had about 50 mgs of ketamine, slow IV pushed. And at that point, I felt like part of my justification was like a controlled decay hole, which is what we call when someone's tripping balls. And so if you're tripping balls with like a traumatic injury, it's probably, if you look at psychedelic medicine, there's set and setting, and you're having a horrible mindset with a horrible set of circumstances in the setting, and then you have pain along with this like perception changer. And ketamine, it's an NMDA antagonist, so it's like dissociating you from reality at high doses. It can be pretty gnarly. So I felt like I could avoid the K hole, and I was like, I'll go in the K space, and I can control the K space, I think was how I reasoned it to the doctor. And when it was happening, I couldn't really see. It felt like a whoosh, like something swirling around my head, like I was kind of in a slow-moving hurricane. And you kind of have visions when that happens. You kind of lose your sense of sight. But I was like, I can't really see right now, but this doesn't hurt as bad, so thank you, but I'm fine. I'm in the K space. So I was like making them feel better about me being on the drugs, because they feared delirium in the hospital significantly. Anyway, that's a whole side note about medical AARs or after action reviews. But anyway, the point is that that is just an example of one of the things I had to deal with in that aftermath immediately after that injury. And then you go through dealing with the loss of legs, quality of life, potentially likely not having future children, and then your friends are getting killed in Afghanistan along the way. There were 4 guys, 4 Green Berets and 2 EOD techs that got killed on the trip, and it just kept happening over and over. And once I became an outpatient in May of 19, my first order of business was getting off of narcotics, and which was miserable. I would sleep 2 or 3 hours a night at best, and it was, I guess for like a 3 or 4 month period, waking up was like waking up into a nightmare every day. And that nightmare got worse every time someone got killed. And so there's a lot of shit to deal with, a lot of shit. And so that's kind of my background of emotional health, and it definitely had a huge change in it when the blast occurred. But I didn't have, it was hard to be positive during the depression, but once I got blown up, I never was going to do anything to kill myself or anything like that, but I kind of expected something to happen on the trip. But afterwards, I never thought about that stuff anymore. Like, I wanted to live, and then right away it was like, I'm done with the Army, and I'm going to do a podcast, and I'm going to do these things. And I remember talking to the SOCOM commander, General Thomas, on a FaceTime for like 45 minutes, which very, very kind soul to just let me ramble on ketamine to him for 45 minutes. It included a whole lot of things, which I'm about to tell you about, but I had told people right away, like any general that came into my hospital room, they're like, what are you going to do next? Do you want to stay in? And I was like, with all due respect, no. And I knew what I wanted to do, and it was kind of what I'm doing right now. So that's my personal background with a little bit of stories along the way. Hopefully it's entertaining, but now we're getting into the specific framework. So there are some people that had significant influences on my mindset coming out of that first deployment. And the first person is former Secretary of Defense Mattis. And when I was coming out of country on that first trip, he just happened to be there, and he talked to a group of Green Berets and Rangers. And he's a very, very, very cool speaker. I think he's one of the great people you could have as a Secretary of Defense, or anybody, to influence what happens in society, because he has his DoD wartime experience and his leadership experience, but he's not stuck in like a DoD mindset of war is the answer. He's almost like a preacher of peace, even though if war is necessary, you'll bring the fucking war type thing. So one of the things I remember about his talk, I think he talked for roughly an hour, is he said, don't leave this deployment going home. Don't go home and be a more angry individual as a result of your experiences, as a result of the things you've had to experience that maybe other people haven't. Go home and focus on how to be more compassionate and how to have post-traumatic growth, and to let this be something that improves you as a person as opposed to something that brings you down. And that really stuck with me. And that was my mentality going home, that even though I was going through what I would call in retrospect a depression, I was trying to understand it so that I could learn from it, so I could be better. And he stimulated that. And during the same time frame, I was reading a book by Dr. Steven Pinker, which is called Enlightenment Now. I think The Case for Science, Reason, and Humanism. And I actually told General Thomas about Steven Pinker in my rambling. And then like a week or two later, I'm on a FaceTime with Steven Pinker, he probably doesn't remember this, but he verbally agreed to be on this podcast. That would be sweet. But anyway, the influence of that book is the reason that book existed. There's a lot of people would be like, stuff sucks. Like, the United States sucks. Like, it sucks to live here. I might as well go somewhere else. And then the argument is that actually this is the greatest time to ever be alive in the history of everything as a human. And all across the world, things are the best that they've ever been. And things like death by war, death by genocide, terrorism, they're the lowest they've ever been. Life expectancy is the best they've ever been. If you take kind of a third world country in Africa, they're living in conditions that are around kind of like 1960s in the United States. And how we've made advances in medicine to reduce the amount of people that die from disease. So just all these like actually showing the data in support of that all these things are the best they've ever been. And doing the due diligence to like acknowledge maybe the problems and the major problems to work on as a society going forward. So anyway, that book had a huge impact on me, and it influenced, kind of gave me terms and operational definitions that resulted in kind of identifying as a humanist, of just wanting the best for people and the best for everybody. And another person that I was consuming a Ken Follett book. He has this trilogy on World War I, II, and the Cold War. Each book is on each one of those, and it just depicts what life is like, and for people before and during and after those wars, and follows the characters' families generationally, and it's fascinating. And there's incredible stories, and it's historically accurate, which is the main reason to read it. You just get a feeling of what the temperature was in those time periods, and makes you really want to kind of have the opinion like, we should remember what World War II was like. This is why we don't do this shit type thing. So I was consuming that, and then I was also listening to Sturgill a lot. And this is before I met him. This is 2018. I got hurt in 19 and met him in 19. But a lot of his work kind of is predicated on the idea that that no matter whatever is troubling, love can help those things. And you see a progression in his music. The third album, his third record, is written for his son, and basically all of his sons now. But it's kind of a guideline on life, and there's a lot of very useful lyrics and emotions associated with that, and just being doing what you can to be as good as you can, and to let yourself feel love and to extend it out to everybody else. And as a side note, his new record, which came out last year, they recorded a couple of years ago, it's called Sound and Fury, is kind of a reflection of getting, I guess, like anxious over the growing insanity that seems to be going on in the world. And that kind of, it's pretty weird right now to listen to that record when all the COVID stuff is happening. But it's just kind of all the storm swirling around in someone's brain. They get like, it just seems like so much. You can get so upset if you just think about all the things that might be going wrong in the world. And so it's just interesting that that's what it came to after the fact. But at the time, listening to him put me at ease about what was going on in life. And then the last person that had a huge effect on me, I'd say, is Brene Brown. And she's a researcher, does a lot of research on shame. But one of her books I mentioned in the first episode is The Gifts of Imperfection. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, about how that influenced me. So those are the people that had an effect on me. Mattis kind of stimulating that post-traumatic growth mentality. Pinker of just expanding like a large-scale philosophy of being concerned for the well-being of people. Sturgill of kind of focusing on love and compassion in life, and then Brene for really enhancing the ability to be compassionate to the self. And so now that's all the background for this framework. So 46 minutes in, let's get into it. So there's some books that I mentioned in the last episode, and reading them and journaling about them constantly made me kind of identify some fundamentals of emotional health, and I call them the pillars of emotional health. And so I think to understand, here's what they are. It's introspection, communication, empathy, and self-love. Those are the pillars of emotional health, and they prop up a roof that is compassion. And so to understand how I got to the pillars, let's talk about Nonviolent Communication, one of those books. So Nonviolent Communication is a book written by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg. And to be honest, the way that the book is written and the way that I am drawing conclusions from it and using it, I think are two different things. And I would assume the guy would approve, but maybe I'll get to talk to him someday. But nonviolent communication is a form of like like a low inflammatory way of conflict resolution or communicating with people. And so the reason this book is good is because it boils it down to four very simple things, which is observe, feelings, needs, request. And the reason I like that is because I read this 2018, and I haven't reread it yet. I'm about to. But I remember those four things. So if you read a book like The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that book sucks. I don't know if you're a fan of it. It's, in my opinion, it's overly complicated. It was written, I think it was published in 91, and so it's written for like the 1980s businessman, like, blah, 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 yes, let's put everything on butcher block. We're making all these graphs and everything so that we understand how things work, and we can make them better by being overly fucking complicated and telling people all these things and telling them how to live. So that doesn't resonate with me. And so nonviolent communication, just with the 4 steps, if you don't remember anything of the book and you just remember the 4 steps, then it's a victory. And I'll explain those to you real quick. So it's best to give you an example, and then I'll talk about them. So let's assume that I'm a guy in a romantic relationship and I'm talking to my female partner. Let's say we're married or we're living together. And I'm like, hey, babe, hey, we talked about how we were going to like clean the kitchen and like maybe kind of organize it and stuff. And it seems to be a little dirty. And I feel stressed because I need order in this space. So are you willing to maybe, I don't know, let's say Sunday and Thursday, we can together kind of clean this place up, organize the dishwasher, and get things kind of in an order that we both agree on? Boom. And then that's like NVC in action right there. So the observation of what was going on, hey, we talked about this is what's happening. That's just observing things without being accusatory. And then feelings and needs occur. So I feel blank because I need blank. And those feelings have nothing to do with the other person. They don't have anything to do, like if I say, I feel that you, then it's wrong. And so maybe there'd be some sort of philosophical discussion if this is how it should be. But if you accept this as the model, then it prevents putting the onus on someone else for your feelings, because other people can be a catalyst for how you feel. Like if someone does something fucked up and it's upsetting to you, then it's normal to be upset. But that's a catalyst, and then you have to identify your feelings and needs, because the model of NVC would suggest that your feelings are representations of needs being met or not being met. And so in this case, I feel stressed because I need order. And it could be like, I feel anxious because I need rest and nurturing, affection, love, and these other things. So already like it's changing an internal vocabulary of how you're framing emotions. And I think it's incredibly valuable, because it is another book, I can't remember what book, but like adults don't make other people feel things unless they're coercing them, like with violence or blackmail or emotional terrorism. So other adults don't make other adults feel things. They can't make them do things. If you're accepting that idea, then okay, then my feelings are what I am having as a response to whatever is going on externally, and I need to honor them by acknowledging them. And so it's difficult to do when you're new to it, because I'd be like, fuck, like I feel what? But what's useful, and you can Google this right now, feelings inventory, NVC, or nonviolent communication, and the needs inventory. There's a PDF for both. And so you can literally look at that list and be like, okay, there's a page for feelings are being met. So there's kind of like positive feelings, and there's one for feelings not being, or needs not being met. And they're kind of negative. So you might go to anxious, and then it has like 8 things that might be different forms of anxiety. So it kind of specifies what that feeling is. Because I feel sad is one thing, but I feel disappointed are 2 different things, or not 2 different things, but it just clarifies it more. So you can do the same thing with needs. There's a list of feelings and needs, and essentially this is a retard-proof way of introspecting to like identify how one feels. And then lastly, the 4th step, which is more for conflict resolution, is creating a request. So you're requesting something of the person you're interacting with, and if they're willing to participate in that request, and it frames it in the way that it's like, together, how can we help my needs being met, or how can we both have our needs being met? So again, observe, feelings, needs, request. It's pretty simple. It's very difficult to do, though. And so I'll talk about this maybe in another episode or later with journaling. But nearly every day I do this exercise in journaling, because I'll write I feel, and then I'll look at the list and literally with my finger go down, and if anything applies, I'll write it down. For I feel blankety blankety blank. And then I'll write I need, and then see what happens there. And what you'll find is that by doing that, you're getting an idea of what your needs are on a regular basis. The feelings are transient. And really, needs can be too, because you can have these needs that show up a lot, or that might just show up in an acute instance. But what you're doing is you're identifying what those needs are, which is incredibly powerful, because then you know what you actually need emotionally, and then you know what to do for yourself, or you know how to request the people in your life to help in that if it's functioning like that. So, nonviolent communication, in my opinion, takes care of 3 of the pillars of emotional health. The first one is introspection. Whether you're a sociopath or just like I was, like really retarded, with the ability to identify how I feel and what I need, then it's you have like a quantifiable way of doing it, which is this very unquantifiable and like qualitative thing of emotions. You can start like quantifying them and writing them down and tracking them, and that provides some understanding. The next thing it does is it works on communication. So it gives you a framework, it gives you a model of how to communicate with people that you care about, and to do so in a way that doesn't throw a grenade on a problem. Because usually, like something in the kitchen that's not a big deal. That's a symptom, right? Like people don't have arguments. You fucking put the forks in the wrong goddamn silverware thing. Like that's not like the original problem, right? There's other shit going on that is resulting in that one little irritation or annoying thing being the subject of an argument. So I think what NVC does in the sake of conflict is it provides a way to, as the title says, non-violently or low inflammatory, like addressing the problem and trying to find a solution together. So it gives people, and then if there's no conflict, then you at least have a model of communicating your feelings. Like, hey, I feel blank because I need blank. I feel stressed because I need emotional stability, or I feel fatigued because I need rest. So can we work on trying to get to bed earlier tonight? Things like that. So then lastly, I think it provides the framework for empathy, because if you implement nonviolent communication to another person, then you are essentially doing a retard-proof way of showing empathy. I just got bothered by the fact that I said retard. Like I have a handicapped brother, so forgive me for using the word retard in this case. But anyway, if you're implementing the feelings and needs thing for someone else, like, what is that person feeling? What is that person needing? And then you can confirm or deny those things by actually asking that person, do you feel anxious? No, I feel fucking pissed off. Oh, okay, so they're angry. Do you need to be understood? Which is, if you read the book, is one of the biggest needs that are not being met that result in conflict. And so mitigating conflict or trying to negotiate between two sides is often the starting process is often trying to understand the other side, from Rosenberg's work and description in the book. But the need to be understood is powerful. And so if you start framing everything like, okay, what is this person did this thing, what needs are being met or not being met that might have resulted in what they're doing. And if they're so erratic that they're, quote unquote, emotionally like unstable or something, then that might be grounds for over time tracking that and like, should this person be in my life? I don't know. That's for you to decide, but it at least gives you the ability to have a framework for empathy. And so those three things are really important to me: introspection, communication, and empathy. I think they're really important to create a foundation, because there's other things that are wildly important for emotional health as an individual, like gratitude and like kindness and the love and stuff. But like if these things aren't done for the self, like the introspection, then it's very difficult to love the self, which is the fourth pillar of emotional health. And so when I was looking at, okay, I've learned these things through NVC. Now what? Like what's the next piece to becoming a healthy individual? And I had all this shame, regret, shame, fear, vulnerability, and Googled, how do I love myself, like I mentioned earlier, and started doing some tasks that were things to care for myself, like self-care. But I think that improving, kind of accepting a model or a framework for just self-compassion is important. And Brene Brown is someone who does that very well. Specifically, which is the only book I've read of hers so far, is The Gifts of Imperfection. And it's predicated on the idea that all people want to have connection. But how do you cultivate connection? And it's not done by blocking all these emotions out of ourselves that we don't like or that we fear, that we have shame about, or that we're vulnerable about. So Brene, there's a sentence in the book that says you have to understand the darkness in order to walk in the light. And so what that means is that we have to start exploring these fears, the shame, the vulnerabilities, to understand them. And then you have things like heroic courage, like ironically enough, like, treating someone in combat or a worst case scenario. But ordinary courage is when you feel vulnerable, sharing that with someone you love. And so it's putting the work in to understand those fears, shame, and vulnerabilities in order to communicate them and have ordinary courage, which is a big, hefty dose of courage. I would much rather be in physical pain than emotional pain. I would much rather jump off a fucking ramp of a C-130 to skydive than to tell someone how I feel, right? But by doing that, it improves the ability to connect with someone. And so you can, if we combine some of these things, these pillars of emotional health, like we identify and we do deliberate introspection to understand ourselves, and then to understand those negative aspects that we maybe have problems with in our personality or our emotions, and then we can communicate them to the people that matter to us, which may not be that large of a circle, but like spouse and certain family members or friends, then that's how we can cultivate that connection with them. But there's one major thing that I've really focused on in Brené's work, and it's the idea that there are things that we do to numb our behaviors, to numb those negative feelings or those negative things that we feel inside of us or that we don't understand inside of us. And so numbing behaviors include any type of, addiction or compulsory behavior, ranging from the classic ones are like gambling, drugs, and then sex, but like anything can be in compulsory behavior. And by the way, eating is one of them, eating certain types of food. So when there's the feeling of anxiety and there's a behavior that is done in response to that is done to cover up how those negative things feel, that is a numbing behavior. And you can't, and this is coming from Brené, you can't selectively numb emotions. If you numb the negative ones, then you numb all of them. So I would argue, kind of my belief is that most people don't understand these negative components of themselves, and they maybe don't even realize the numbing coping mechanisms that have built up in response to them. And those become defining characteristics of your psyche or your personality or just your behaviors. And so it's not bad to like want to shop on the internet or to fuck around on Instagram or to participate in sexual activity or masturbate or anything like that. But if it's being done in response to negative feelings like anxiety, then it's just covering up the ideology of that anxiety. And so through Brené's work, I started a journal constantly about things that I'm reading. I'll highlight annotations and then journal about them. I identified some of those behaviors in myself, those numbing behaviors. And it's not identifying them and being like, oh, fuck, I do these things. That's not the value. The value isn't like, fuck, I do these things and now I feel guilty whenever I do them. And sometimes that guilt and shame already exists, like whether it's like sexual repression, whether it's from religion or just society of like, I shouldn't be doing these things, or like I fucking hate that I want to eat right now, but I can't stop. Because what I have learned is that shame-based behaviors are incredibly powerful. They're very difficult to change. I've been a personal trainer for the Biggest Loser type challenge in college, and then I, kind of worked and still kind of participate in the fitness industry. And so influencing behavior when people either don't have like a full commitment to change, or even if they do, and it's a shame-based behavior, is incredibly powerful. Just in a small circle of friends that I have, I've had issues with like that sexual compulsion based thing, and then other people with drinking or other people with eating. And one of my friends, she said, it's interesting because you would look at like a dessert, you as Justin, and be like, that's not something I want. That doesn't fit in with my goals. But like another person who has a shame-based behavior with eating or something, they would not be able to just like turn the light switch off and just move past that, because that's something that is a learned behavior over time that's like ingrained as part of their behavior pattern. So as a side note, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm just kind of synthesizing information that I've learned. So If you feel that all this is bullshit, then do your own research. But this has been incredibly helpful for me. So I think when you consider like negative behaviors as numbing, then you can identify them. But the work is not just to identify those and then to feel shitty about them. The work is to understand why they exist, why those things are numbing something else, and what is the thing that they're numbing, and why is there those feelings. Like, so if I have anxiety and I want to eat something, I want to eat like a dessert, then why? Where is that anxiety coming from? You just basically 5-year-old at death. Why? What? Like, for example, I've had to look at something kind of off topic, but like, why do I have an issue with authority type thing? And so like, I'd be like, why? And then I kind of go back, and then it kind of, for me, started occurring like around 7 years old or something. And that kind of like generated a coping behavior based off of something going on in my life. And it kind of turned into a part of my personality. So the why is important, and that's the benefit of deliberate introspection. So Brené's work is essentially a guide to compassion and compassion with the self. And I think that if someone were to read that book, if you read Nonviolent Communication, you get the first 3. And I've already explained it, but you get introspection, communication, and empathy. And then if you read The Gifts of Imperfection, you get compassion. But it's not, you can't fully have compassion for everybody else if you don't have compassion for yourself. And you don't fully show up for everybody else if you don't accept the self. So if there are these things that you hate about your personality, or that you hate about yourself, and you don't love yourself and don't accept who you are, then you're not doing your due diligence of showing up for everybody else. And Brené, and she did I think the woman's name is Glennon Davis. They did a podcast, but they talked about this concept that like as a mother, accepting the self, and that allows their children to see an example of saving the self. Instead of just suffering for everybody else, you take care of the self. I think it's incredibly important, and I think that's kind of the foundation for how to learn to be compassionate. It's just that these books, all that bullshit I talked about earlier about my particular life and all the people that influenced me, resulted in reading these books and kind of culminating into this framework. And so the framework is that you have these pillars of emotional health: introspection, communication, empathy, self-love, and they prop up compassion. But once you like learn about these things and accept them, it's not like there's a fucking light switch that, oh, okay, I'm compassionate now, or I do all these things well all the time. No, and this is a great word that Brené uses, and it's cultivate. You have to cultivate these things on a regular basis. And that's essentially what I do every day. And I think that's the challenge of most people, is to try and cultivate these things. Because what makes people happy in life, obviously it's not fucking money. Like, we see plenty of people that have lots of money that are just miserable or seemingly crazy and stuff. And what the consistency in the research, which I know little about, but Brené is the expert, so I'll take her word for it. I'm kind of bought into it, is that connection is what's fulfilling to people, along with like life's work and stuff. And that's why that third book, Man's Search for Meaning, is something I said in the first episode. You can kind of find meaning by learning from Viktor Frankl. But aside from like meaning, connection is what ultimately brings us happiness in life. And so connecting with ourselves is step number 1 in order to properly cultivate connection with other people. So that's essentially the framework. It's a long roundabout way of saying like trying to love the self, but to work on it and to cultivate it. But what does that actually mean? And what is the value in this? Like, understanding why we feel things is incredibly important. So here's something that I think is definitive. I think the onus is on the individual to share to other people how they feel. And have you ever been in a relationship where someone is like, you didn't do this thing, or you did do this thing, whatever. And you're like, I didn't know that was important to you, or I didn't know. So the expectation was not known. Imagine if your boss came in and be like, hey, why didn't you do the TPS report like this? And your response is like, I didn't know that was the case. Like, well, too bad, you're fucking fired. and you get fired for like not knowing to do something. At least that's one thing in the military that is supposed to be inherent, is that you sign a counseling statement of like, these are the expectations of what you are supposed to do. These are your left and right limits of what your function is. So if you don't do that, then they have like the justification to like, okay, you didn't do this, so you're going to get punished now. So at the very least, that expectation exists. But in relationships, that's, I don't know. I've been in a lot of relationships where that's not the case, right? And so I think the onus is on the individual to provide that expectation, which means that it's the onus is on the individual to share how they're feeling so that the other person or the other people understand how they're feeling. And then that probably allows for things like compassion from them to you, and then vice versa. So understanding how you feel is important, because generally speaking, when you don't understand something, you fear it. And fear is one of those three things Brené talks about: fear, shame, vulnerability. So when you don't understand, you fear. And when you fear something significantly and you don't understand it, you hate it. And so if you can begin to understand the self, then my hypothesis is that you understand the self, then you don't have the fear of understanding. You might still fear some things about yourself or fear things in your life, but at least you don't have the fear due to not understanding. And therefore that's one way to start chipping away at the hate. In this case, I'm referring to self-hate. So I think that framework is really important, because it all starts with deliberate introspection. And so there are a few different ways that you can do that. One of the ways that society is extremely resistant to is like getting professional help. Like there are people whose jobs that exist in order to help with these things, and they're called counselors and therapists. And so you have to have the right one, though, because unfortunately not all of them are that good. Like when you look at medical doctors, like 50% of them were in the bottom half of their class. And that's the same for therapists. Like not all of them are hot shit. So you really have to find one that maybe you have like a methodology in mind, or maybe you have a framework in mind that you want to utilize and leverage. And if that person doesn't have it, or they're resistant to something that you're doing, then maybe that creates problems. So you got to find the right person, and then they have to properly open you up and get you to explore these things about yourself. So it's like dependent on another person, which is fine. And a lot of them are extremely successful and helpful. And I've never left a counseling session like, oh, fuck, that was a waste of time. But how often do you see a counselor? Like maybe if someone's kind of like feeling poopy, then they might see him weekly. So it's like 1 out of 7 days, 1 hour out of 7 days, or 2 hours out of 7 days that you see someone. So I just don't like it's a fantastic form of deliberate introspection, but I think there needs to be more from the individual. It's kind of like when I talk in terms of like strength and conditioning, and someone has a musculoskeletal based injury, usually like a chronic type thing, overuse. So let's talk about a tendon issue. Could be like in their proximal hip flexor, or like some tendonitis in their quadriceps tendon down by their knee, like right up just superior to the patella, the knee joint. So if someone has those things, then it'd be like, okay, well, this took a long time to develop because this tendon doesn't have blood flow. It doesn't, you can't like directly work the fibers of that tendon to try and rehab it like a muscle belly. So it's going to take longer to eradicate, because the reason it's there is because you have improper mechanics, which is misloading the structures, which is resulting in strain at the tendon. And it took a long time to get to that point. So it's going to take some time to work on it. It's going to take some deliberate action to try and rehab it. And then it's not that deliberate action will stay at that frequency and intensity or whatever all the time. So in other words, like if someone's like, hey, do this exercise 5 times a day, like, do 3 sets of 12 reps 5 times a day. And are you always going to do 5? Is the recommendation always going to be to rehab that 5 times a day? No. Like once it improves and the structure starts to heal, and maybe the movement patterns that caused it are refined and relearned, then eventually that problem will go away, or you just have maintenance on it. So maybe it's like once every couple days you do like one iteration of rehab as opposed to doing it 5 times a day. I think the same thing applies to something like deliberate introspection, because if you've identified that some improvement would be helpful, then if you're in a bad spot emotionally, you're accepting some emotional unhealth, which is already difficult to do, then you might have to do some more work in the beginning, and maybe for, let's say, 1, 2, 3 months or something, and then it might kind of peter out after that. So the deliberate introspection, I think, is part of that. And so the way that I've done it, and what I'm going to recommend, and is journaling. And so what that does, there's multiple reasons, but it lets you put thoughts down on paper, because it's like getting them out of your head, putting them somewhere so that you can almost like not worry about them. But I think journaling by hand also slows your thought process down, because already thinking is 100 miles an hour, cell phones and all that bullshit. So the better that you can slow everything down, the more you can process. And so I actually got that from Chuck Palahniuk. He wrote Fight Club. He was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he writes all of his books longhand, which is insane, because I've written books that are not near the length of his, and I couldn't imagine doing that. But he writes them longhand because like the word processor feels too finalized, like it's too official. And so when you write by hand and you just kind of, you don't worry about messing up with spelling or grammatical mistakes, or you crossing things out, there's a little bit of freedom in that, but it also slows you down. And then you get to process these things as you're writing at the speed of your writing. Because I can type like the wind, but I have to write a lot slower. So I find it extremely valuable. And then the tactics of journaling are really important. And I think that I had one friend, and he was like, when I journal, it's just kind of, I feel like I'm just beating myself up. Like, my parents called, I didn't call them back. I don't want to be someone that does that. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. It's just normal thought processes in a normal day, but piling that on top of yourself will definitely become problematic from a negative mindset perspective, especially if you have other things like anxiety or like depression and stuff like that. Because people that have experienced depression or PTSD, you know what I'm talking about with that downward spiral. It's just like every thought that you have is just like beating the shit out of yourself until you just hit the bottom. And so that becomes very difficult. So journaling, in my opinion, is a way to do that. And so you should always ask why. What are your feelings and why? What are you grateful for and why? What do you like about yourself and why? A lot of you guys are asking questions about the journaling. I could probably do an hour just on journaling, because apparently I ramble like a madman anyway. But I could talk a lot about journaling. But those are some simple things. What do I feel? Why? What am I grateful for? Why? What do I like about myself? Why? And doing those things in journaling, not only you start to excise some of the things that are going on, you understand those negative feelings that you might have and acknowledge the good feelings. So you're honoring all the feelings. Because a lot of times when we feel poopy, like I'm in my kitchen right now. I used to sit against the fridge and cry into my knees in 2018. So the crying is awful. It feels so shitty. And then you don't want to do that thing. So then you develop these behaviors to avoid that shit, especially when you're going through a rough time. So I didn't honor those negative feelings. Like when someone you care about dies, you have to honor those feelings. Because here's the deal. When you take those negative things and you compartmentalize them, and I'm an expert at that, as a special operations medic and as an 18 Delta, which is a Green Beret medic, if I'm thinking about emotional shit as I'm treating someone, or if I'm in a firefight for that matter, then I'm failing, right? So part of my job is to compartmentalize, and that's ingrained in the training, like where you're getting yelled at, all this shit's going on. Sometimes combat noises are being played on loudspeakers as we're treating patients in training. So compartmentalizing is part of what I do. But when you compartmentalize, you take that feeling and you put it on the shelf, and then it doesn't sit there and turn into a fucking diamond. It turns into a piece of coal. And then eventually, when all that coal on all the shelves, all those feelings you keep putting on the shelves, that shit's going to burn down eventually. And I think that's important, because I've had friends kill themselves. So avoiding that compartmentalizing and honoring those feelings is incredibly important. And so in my opinion and my suggestion, journaling is one of those avenues. And otherwise you have to have a really good friend that can, as my counselor says, someone that tells you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. And those friends are kind of hard to come by sometimes. But if you're not journaling and you're not going to counseling, you have to be able to consider things. And usually the person by themselves is not a very good metric of that. At least with like the paper, when you're writing on the paper, you can read it back and be like, fuck, I was being negative yesterday. But when you're talking, and I don't know if you'd record yourself, I've never done that. If you're talking about how you're feeling and listen to it later, it sounds time consuming, but you'd have to be able to dissect your feelings and do the deliberate introspection to have someone kind of confirm or deny, or to like guide, or just listen. There's a lot of things that someone can do for another person, but so if you're not, it seems like counseling, talking to someone, or journaling are like the main forms of deliberate introspection. So yeah, I'm not saying that one is better than the other necessarily, but in the best case scenario, you would holistically approach things and you do as many of those things as possible to introspect. So counseling with journaling with talking to your friends, and then maybe some of you guys have some other methods too, but finding a way to deliberately introspect, and then making the communication of those things that you learn a regular part of your life, which is, Brene puts a whole section of it in her book that it's ordinary courage, that it's not natural to do and it's scary to do. And I don't think I'm cool by any means, but I told you some pretty vulnerable shit about my life in the first 5 minutes of this podcast, that I'm scared of what I'm doing. And I've done all kinds of weird ass shit and almost died a lot, and then almost died hardcore one time. So yeah, just because you're inoculated to fear doesn't mean that you don't have vulnerability. So communicating that is incredibly important. And then empathizing with other people allows you to maybe see them in a different way. I used to drive around and someone was driving like a dickhead, I'd be like, this fucking guy, he's being a dick. Why is he driving like that? But now when someone's driving like a dick, because there's two things going on. I can have the mindset oh, why is that guy driving like that? Maybe his kid's about to be born in the hospital. Maybe he's about to be late for work, and if he's late again, he's going to be fired, or maybe he's just a dick. I don't know. But then the second thing is regardless of what that analysis is, why the fuck do I care? Why does it bother me? So, but that empathy I was talking about, or maybe in this case, it's synonymous with compassion for another person. You're at least considering what's going on with other people on a regular basis, which I haven't even gone on a rant about social media, but that'll have implications with other shit too, of how we interact with other people and how we derive our philosophical beliefs of what we should do in life, of where to even derive our politics from it. And I'm never going to say you should believe one thing or the other. I just want people to think about what they believe. So I think compassion and empathy is a part of that. And then I've already explained how the importance, the incredible importance of self-compassion and love, it changes everything in your life. And it allows you to connect in ways that you never could if you hadn't really loved yourself before. And it's real difficult to love yourself when you fucking hate yourself, especially when you just want to die. And so I hope to everything that this has value to you guys. So in special operations, we have this idea, specifically in special forces, I can't speak for the other units, what's the so what? If we go on an operation in a valley to try and clear bad guys out of it, what's the so what? What's the second and third order effects of that? And so I think that by using a framework that is predicated on these pillars of emotional health to prop up compassion and to implement compassion and cultivate it on a regular basis, that you have the acceptance of self-worth, you have courage to connect, that alone is a scary thing. And then you have the capability and the courage to begin to forgive yourself. So if you have regrets, forgiveness is very if someone's like, can you just work on forgiving yourself? It's not a light switch. I can't go boom, all right, I fucking forgive myself, because there'll be some days I'm journaling and I'm like, okay, I'm working, I'm learning to do so. Who I was at that time is different than who I was now, and I didn't know all these things now. That's why it's difficult. when I learned all these things about emotional health, it was like, fuck, I could have done better. And that probably made it worse. But then getting to the idea that I was doing the best that I could at the time. I'm a fucking human. I'm just a human in certain circumstances. I put myself in certain circumstances of being a Green Beret, and I'm just trying to fucking deal with it. And having some empathy and compassion for that hypothetical self, which is, the actual self. So what is that if you can accept the self and identifying the worth of yourself and having the courage to do that and to cultivate that within the self and cultivate that with other people, and then being able to forgive, those are very powerful things, and they can change everything about a personality. Because even 6 months ago, I'm not the same person I am now. A year ago, 18 months ago, 24 months ago, completely different. And so it's okay. You don't have to make these large scale developments in life. And this is a huge component of Brené's work, and I failed to cover it. But feeling worthy of your own love is probably one of her fundamental aspects of that book. Because when you have these things that you suppress, you numb all these behaviors because you don't acknowledge these things you don't like, fears, shame, vulnerabilities, then those things result in you not feeling worthy of anything. And that can extend into when you're sitting here in quarantine right now. Most of you are sitting in your house and you're listening to my rambling ass voice, and you're like, man, I want to accomplish all these things. And then if you don't accomplish those things, you'll be like, fuck, I didn't accomplish these things. Like, I could have done better. I should have done better. But what is a better practice is to wake up every day and say, I am worthy of my own love. I am worthy of my own acceptance. And anything I do today is not going to change that. Anything I do is not going to have any bearing on how I feel about myself. It's just icing on the cake because I already love myself when I wake up. And it's not like innuendo. It's just like I feel worthy of my own love first thing. And so if I don't, I'll just say things I would do. Like if I don't journal today, or if I don't meditate, or I don't do yoga, or I don't exercise, or I don't work on this podcast or this website, or try to post something on social media to help people. If I don't do any of those things, like, it still means that I'm worthy of my own love. Like I'm still a person, still a good person. I'm just trying to fucking make it. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that even if you don't do all this shit, like I started this podcast talking about people on social media. If you're not coming out of quarantine, fucking developing yourself, then you're a piece of shit, is basically what I see all the fucking time. Or I see people just complaining about shit all the time. So that second one, we're gonna ignore that for now. But you don't have to have a shame-based relationship with yourself of why you should be doing things. I can tell you, like being a Green Beret on a deployment, on that first trip, I'm never going to run out of shit to do. I'm a medic. I'm in charge of preventing the bad health of everybody on camp. We got, 80 Americans, 20 Afghans, and my friend and I, another Delta, we're in charge of doing preventative medicine and the well-being of everybody. And personally, as a Green Beret, like it's not like a trauma-based thing for me. Like, okay, when trauma happens, I'll fucking be a medic. Like I perceive it as like the well-being of everybody under my care is my responsibility, which is a fucking heavy ass thing if you're trying to like be there for the physical, mental, emotional, and possibly spiritual well-being of everybody. So it's not that I can do all those things, but I need to. I feel like I want to enable those things. I still do for the Special Forces community, and then anybody listening to my fucking voice right now. Like I feel that's why I've had issues getting this done, because I want to help with all those things, but there are a lot of things I can say right now to do for your physical, emotional, and mental health, spiritual too. But I could give you a list of like 10 things for each one of those things. Then all of a sudden you got like 40 things to do every day. That's not realistic though. So you gotta pick the ones that are important to you. You got to pick the ones that are valuable to you, that give you what you need. And identifying what you need is probably one of the first steps. And I think deliberate introspection is how you do that. Because then once you know what you need, then you can start filling your day with those things. Because there might be a lot of things that can help, but goddamn, if you're just trying to do fucking like 20 things every day, like that's exhausting. And then you have the mentality like I should have done that. I suck. And that's just not productive. And all the questions I get about what to do during this quarantine, I think the first thing to do is to try to establish that connection with the self and the acceptance of the self, so that you don't perceive things that you do are what give you value, because the value should be inherent. And that's difficult to do, and you have to learn how to do it, and you have to cultivate it. That's why I wanted to share this framework. So I hope that wasn't too fuzzy. I hope it was, I had a general organization, sort of a general outline, kind of bounced around, little stories here and there, but that's the general idea. And so I asked you guys yesterday on Instagram to give you some questions regarding emotional well-being. So I'm going to take a little break, maybe play some of Bobby's music, and then we're going to come back, and I'm going to do some question and answer, and that probably help fill in some blanks if there are any. We'll be right back. Ooh-wee. I really like that music. I'm trying to get him to put it together, release a record, because I really like it. But all right, so in the last little segment, spent a lot of time talking about me, spent a lot of time talking about this framework I keep referencing: introspection, communication, empathy, and self-love. Prop up compassion. Because you can have you can be compassionate to people, but then you just have like low emotional intelligence, or you're just not, implementing things properly. So understanding the self, dissecting the self, understanding the why allows self-acceptance. And then you can communicate that in order to cultivate connection. You can understand other people better with the empathy, especially when you do that work on yourself. It definitely gives you a level of empathy for other people. And overall, that just cultivates a level of compassion that is very useful in life, and then can be implemented in things like kindness and gratitude. And part of the reason why all this is important, and why these like positive mindset type things are good things to cultivate and to practice, is because when you have a type of thought, there's a certain neurotransmitter release in the brain. All right, this is all like science, so I'm not going to cite anything. Just look it up, or call my bullshit, whatever, I don't know. But when you have thoughts, you have an acute neurotransmitter response. And then that thought and that type of chemical response being done regularly will have a chronic adaptation, which is a structural brain adaptation. So literally the structure, the physicality of your brain will be different if you have a negative type mindset over time. And then it will be different if you have like a gratitude-based mindset. So that's not to say that you can just like will yourself out of like mental health problems, because certain types of emotional health problems, they need medication and they need proper counseling. I have an opinion of medication, but in severe cases you do need it. And then certain conditions preclude you from like avoiding the medication. So always go to your doctor, your therapist, to have the best approach. But what we can do is we can control those thoughts over time, and we can, by understanding our feelings, but we can practice certain things like gratitude. That's why the gratitude journal is so popular. It's like, what 3 things are you grateful for? Which I think is valuable, but I would add on why, because the why provides understanding. And the more understanding of the self, then the better we are regularly doing it. We're not scared of the self. So it's almost like that exposure therapy. If we're exposing ourselves to the negative parts of ourselves on the regular basis, then we learn to accept them, and we accept them through understanding. And then it allows us to communicate and empathize with other people for the same things. So I think it's all relevant. But that's in a nutshell what we talked about and a little bit of extra why. And so I asked you guys on social media for some questions, and we got a handful of them. So let's get to it. So I didn't include the username of the person asking the question. I didn't want other people to, search them and then, bully him or something. Social media is weird, but so I feel bad because I'm not giving you guys your props, but you know who you are. And sometimes I very lightly edited the question just so it's a little more clear, it makes more sense. So first question, what do you feel helps the most, quote, in the moment, end quote, when sadness and anger bubble up? And like a secondary question, which someone else asks, which is related, is how do you get out of your own head when you're depressed, anxious, or stressed? And I think I had an instance of this about, a week, 10 days ago, where when you, generally speaking, when you have an emotional health thing that you're dealing with, thing kind of meaning like depression or whatever, regardless if there is like a tangible name for what you're experiencing or not, I don't think it's quite relevant, because all that is just so we can diagnose it and then the insurance industry can then deal with it. So that's why the DSM exists. I may be a little cynical, so if you're a therapist, like don't bite my nuts off, because I ain't got any. But so if you're in the moment of you're in the bottom. I don't know, when you hit the bottom, I told you I would sit against the fridge crying, sit on the floor, and there's everything. I'm just remembering 10 days ago or so, everything is just negative. Just every self-thought is negative. You try, and if someone suggests something positive to you, you just find a way to make it negative. And then or there's crying, or there's just like extreme anxiety. I've had a panic attack a few times, essentially, where it just feels like inside your brain is screaming. And shit's intense. But so you have the panic situation, and then you just have like the negative mindset situation. I think those are slightly different. But the first thing to do is to honor it and to experience it. But sometimes in the panic thing, and by the way, I'm not a therapist, so don't listen to me. I don't know. I've just had panic attacks. I'm not an expert in dealing with them, so go find someone that's an expert, please. But with panic attacks, for me in that instance, the one that I'm thinking of, I just had to remove myself from the situation. Which was a large group of people. I didn't know them. It was very loud, and it was on a day that was difficult for me because of the date, and I just had to remove myself. So maybe that's step number one, is if you're in an environment or circumstance that you can't control that is like inducing or making it worse, then do your best to politely excuse yourself and maybe have some alone time, if that's helpful, or getting to a circumstance is better than the one you're in. That's all I'm going to say, because I don't want to get specific and fuck this whole recommendation thing up. So that's for the panic type stuff. But when you're in the moment of just being negative, you can honor it, but just let it. If it comes out with crying, like it's a very therapeutic thing with crying. And as a dude shoots guns and fucking kills bad guys, like that's not something we do in our job. I can't really go to work and with my team, I could cry in front of everybody, and especially now at this point, like they all played a role in me being alive, and we have this bond. But like in general, the teams I've been on, like I've been close enough with the guys, and we had a great rapport and great team atmosphere where if I needed to cry, I could, and I wouldn't say that's normal. So ignoring the whole special operations thing for a second, I think that if you need to get a cry out and you're a dude, fucking do it. But just focusing on the negative is not a recipe for improvement. And so the only thing I really come back to is just trying to do something for the self. And one of the things that kind of put this on social media is like, it could be just getting a glass of water, doing anything that has like a net effect for the self, because you're already lost. Like if you started the day and you're like, I am worthy of my own love, and then you're having this like really bad moment, like you're not doing that whole you're not doing the thought process shit to help. So doing something at the moment, giving yourself some time, 5-10 minutes of like being at rock bottom. And then when you're finally able to pull yourself out of it, then start working towards doing something for the self. A glass of water is like a great one because it's like this tangible thing, like it's doing something other than just fucking hating yourself. And then drinking an entire glass of water has health benefits that, you know, could improve metabolism. It stops you from being hungry. The first sign of dehydration is hunger. It's helping with metabolism. Everything runs better when you're more hydrated. So, and then it's like this cool thing. So you can, if you wanted to like kind of do an energy or like a visualization, you imagine like this cool, like soothing thing coming into your body. One of them, that's what she said things, but it's just soothing thing that you're ingesting and you're doing it for yourself. So it's like, it's something that you're choosing to do instead of just like laying on the floor fucking being miserable. Another thing that I find extremely beneficial, which doesn't always work, is like going into like maybe an SOS meditation. For instance, I use the app Headspace, and they have specifically like 1 to 3 minute SOS, like shit's hitting the fan, I'm stressed, anxious. There's different ones, but it's like literally just a breathing exercise. So, like in the case of like a panic attack or just like fucking crying a lot and you're just breathing really rapidly, like trying to slow that breathing will help. So taking big deliberate breaths in and out, and it has physiological implications. I mean, breathing does in general. So meditation and breathing are fantastic practices to do on a regular basis, especially in a negative mindset situation, because it's going to induce a bunch of parasympathetic hormones to kind of work against the sympathetic ones. Sympathetic, fight and flight; parasympathetic, rest and digest. It's essentially like slowing things down, slowing the heart rate down, decreasing the blood pressure, like improving oxygenation, soothing. Those are the types of things that you need. And so an app, if you got an app that can help with that, then rock on with your bad self. Develop your own method of doing something in the moment, but it's doing something is going to be necessary. And sometimes with depression, you just feel like you want to lay around all the time, but you know, there's second and third order effects of just doing nothing and not eating and not drinking all day. So like even just like making a snack, banana, I don't know, doing something to put something in your body that's good for you can have positive net effects. So for me personally, those are the things that I do. You know, what also is crazy is like taking a shower. No one like feels shittier after a shower unless you like shit in the shower. But then we got other issues if that's going on. But just doing something. So when you're in the moment, sadness, anger, you're just trying your best to mitigate it and not beating yourself up over it. And if you have a person that is like your emergency person, and I find it helpful to kind of like set up, we call it a PACE plan in the military. It's like a contingency planning. So you have a primary, alternate, contingency, and then emergency, and that's PACE. So the primary is something that you would do first, and if that's not available or that's broken, then you go to the alternate and so on. So you might have someone that is part of your PACE plan, like, hey, you explain to them, like, sometimes I have these bad moments and I isolate myself because, like, me personally, my habit is to isolate. As I think this for most people, especially in this job of special operations, because it's like if you show weakness or something, then we fear that because we got to be tough all the time. We're fucking doing the shit we got to do all the time. We're doing all the things, and then if we say we're weak or we need to take a knee, then we're a pussy. And I've seen that happen many times on important matters and big deals, and then small deals too. So if you establish with someone they have these moments of, you know, whatever you want to call them, perceived weakness, and that they might be your emergency contact to mitigate those things. You can set that up ahead of time. It's a responsible thing to do. This would be somebody you trust and that you've started to cultivate a connection with. Then that person can be there for you, and that can be helpful too. So hopefully those are some methods that give you some ideas. Next question. Is it possible to have emotional improvement during social distancing? I kind of feel like this whole episode is about that. And the main thing I would keep in mind is that you don't have to do anything. And like that means, like, generally speaking, like, you don't have to breathe. There are just consequences. So you have like certain things in your life you have to do, otherwise you have consequences. But there are a lot of things that you might feel that you need to do in your day because you have your worth tied to them. So I think that the important thing with emotional improvement during social distancing is the first step is just accepting, is just identifying the fact that you are worthy of your own love right away. And if that's not, I understand that's not a light switch thing. You can't just be all of a sudden, oh fuck, I love myself. So you gotta implement some of the tactics, and I think that the emotional framework helps with that. Deliberate introspection and learning how to communicate. So you can read that book, Nonviolent Communication. You can start journaling. I think meditation is a huge component of all of this because it tempers the busyness of the mind. It tempers the emotional storm that can occur if our brains or our minds are left unchecked. Just going down these rabbit holes of social media and how it can kind of like indirectly and like subversively kind of influence behavior patterns, and that you're seeing all these perfect things all the time. You're seeing these representations of these misrepresentations of reality all the time. And so then you're perceived like, oh, that person's fucking working out every day and I'm not working out. Oh, I'm such a piece of shit. Like that can definitely get in the way of emotional improvement during social distancing. So, I think finding evaluating the self, so doing some kind of introspection, and just trying to how do you feel in your life, and then identifying that, and then if you're doing that and you never do that, that's emotional improvement. If you're just doing the act of like trying to think about how you feel and you don't really ever do that, then boom, you're already having emotional improvement during social distancing without even fucking trying. Not without trying, but like without like anything real significant. So you have like with behavior change, you have some people can be like boom, and they just go all in on something, and then that's just how they are from now on. But it's usually not how things work, especially with shame. So you got to like ease into things. When I talk about all this shit that I personally do, I didn't just start doing it one day at once. It's that I gradually built up into them over time. Like all the journaling techniques I use, I go in and out of them. I probably got like 5 of them or so. But I had to come to the conclusion of like, oh, the NVC, like I feel and I need every day, so I can see where I'm at every day. And then if I'm like, oh, gratitude and why, what am I feeling and why? What do I like about myself and why? Which that one started like in the last week. So there's these things that you can develop your own methods, but you have to start somewhere. And I think that just like maybe initiating the mindset of like evaluating the self might be a good first step to answer that question. The next question is, what are some ways to reduce anxiety? Which might be related to a couple questions ago, but anxiety can be fucking a bitch. But let's just go with like low to moderate anxiety, not like the panic attack type. And that's going to be dependent on the individual. So here's an analogy to all this. Like when I used to run 70s Big for strength and conditioning, I could have made a lot of money making these bullshit cookie cutter programs. Buy my 12-week program, 6-8-week, 12-week program. I don't know why that character is a hillbilly, but I could have just like, here's a program, do these things, execute. But like that level of volume, intensity, frequency, that's not relevant to everybody. Maybe I could like fit in, 60, 70% of the population, but I don't like cookie cutter approaches. I don't like saying like, just do these things and you're good, because that's not how the world works. That's not how individuals work. I want to teach people how to program their training. I want people to like, oh, my goals are this. This is my current state of adaptation. This is my end state, so these are the types of exercises that would fit into that. This is the type of conditioning I could do to fit in with this, whether it's health, performance, whatever. So that's like how I approach that. In the same way I would approach emotional programming, I guess, is that I would want you to understand the tools and then how to use those tools to tinker away at yourself. Acutely, breathing by itself. You do a breathing exercise of any kind, but there are certain ones that are like 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out, like an inhale, 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, out for 4 seconds, hold for 4. So that's one that definitely has like a parasympathetic stimulation. And I got to look at the research, but breathing exercises can have physiological implications that are beneficial for hours out, like 18 hours afterwards. I don't know. I should probably look at the research, but But breathing, top notch. And then there are different types of breathing too. So depending on how weird you want to get into it, there's all kinds of shit like nasal breathing from the oxygen advantage to just like yoga type breathing. I think yoga is I've been doing that a lot lately. It's an excellent way to reduce anxiety. Another thing is just doing some light exercise, which you don't really have to do. Going for a walk, getting outside, getting the sun on your body to produce vitamin D, but just getting outside and being somewhere that's not in a fucking contained box, because humans didn't evolve to be inside of a box all the time, like our house. So there's all kinds of things you can do to reduce anxiety, but what is it that helps you? What do you like doing? Because I could just name like 6 things. I'm not saying do all that shit. You could, but that's a lot of stuff, because I certainly wouldn't want to be like, oh, fuck, I didn't go outside today. On top of like, I didn't exercise, and then you start like beating yourself up. Because there's this concept, which I forgot to talk about earlier, of perfectionism. I think Brene writes about it in the book that someone came up to her and was like, oh, this is all great about shame, but when are you going to write a book about perfectionism? And Brene was like, this is the book for that, because perfectionism is the idea that you're not worthy. And so you work towards all these things, grades, appearance, performance, that you're trying to maximize the potential. And maximizing potential in things is not bad. But when you also have when you're doing it out of a shame-based way, then that is building this idea that you're not worthy. And so personally, I would never want to plateau in my life. And you can't exponentially increase your fitness forever. You can't exponentially improve your emotional health forever. It's gonna taper out, and you're gonna try and maintain. You're gonna have dips, and that's not really up to you. So the idea of being perfect, of completing the perfect song, the perfect paper, the perfect book, or the report, or whatever it is you're doing for school, work, or personal art, a lot of times that perfectionism drives us away. It's the ultimate form of procrastination. Because if I can't get this to be perfect, then I'm not even going to bother with it, because it's so overwhelming to deal with. So don't let the striving for perfection. That's the thing. Okay, this is a huge thing. This is one of my rants. It's the thing I hate about like a lot of social media people and entrepreneurs, and a lot of guys in my job. I don't know if it's ruffling feathers, whatever, but a lot like the mentality of this job, and a lot of guys that, even guys who have, seen a lot of combat or been wounded and so on, or just guys that got out and now they're running companies and stuff, is like, you just have this undying drive to fucking accomplish shit. And if you're not doing that, then you're fucking wrong type thing. Just, you got to be working on all these things constantly. That is what we do in our job because we have to, but that is also what we do because we never feel enough, which I think there are some implications from sub-societies that influence that, but that's not the scope of what I'm talking about right now. But that's the mentality of a lot of entrepreneurs. You got to be grinding. You got to fucking wake up and get on the grind. And fucking Arnold said, sleep faster. Like, I won't go on my sleep rant, but sleep is literally the thing that augments everything else in your life for everything. Mental, emotional, physical health, all augmented by sleep. You can name any body part, and I'll tell you how sleep improves it. One time I was talking to one of my friends, and I was like, name a body part, and I'll tell you how sleep improves it. He's like, your toes, man. And I was like, oh, God damn it. Like, of course he's going to pick something ridiculous. And I was like, okay, well, here's this. There's our actual research studies that with people with type 2 diabetes, that all they did was improve their sleep with the CPAP, which is that mask that kind of puts positive pressure. So it opens the glottis. Sometimes people are overweight or whatever the condition is. Have issues with breathing. So if you have issues getting air in with every breath, then you're not getting the full amount of air, and therefore your oxygen saturation is lower. So by wearing this breathing device, they essentially improve their quality of sleep because they got full breaths in all night, as opposed to getting, 70% breath in every breath all night for years and years. So they got full breaths in without doing anything else. These people with type 2 diabetes improve their insulin sensitivity. And I don't know all the fucking data because that's not really how I work with this stuff. But so that's an example of how sleep benefited, improved their insulin sensitivity. And gout is a huge symptom, or lack of perfusion or blood flow to extremities is a huge problem with type 2 diabetes. So that was my quick answer on like how sleep can help your toes. So in any case, the whole like cut into your, by the way, sleep has a direct correlation. For myself, I would even argue causation for my emotional well-being and my emotional state on a day-to-day basis. And the chronic amount of sleep or not has an effect on my emotions also, to the point that when I journal, I write down the date, I write down the day and the time, I write down how I feel on a scale of 1 to 5, and I write down how much sleep I got the night before. And the first sentence is usually talking about the sleep related to how I feel and if I need to improve it that night or not. So that's how important I think it is. Like I would argue that it's causal, but there's definitely correlational relationship between sleep and emotional health. So that what I'm doing is I'm making an argument against like the entrepreneur, the grinder, the hard worker, that type mindset. You just undyingly do your shit and you just fucking work on yourself all the time because that is what Americans do. Like that whole mentality I have an issue with because it doesn't leave time for the self unless you program it in. So it's okay to work on all those things. But if you accept that all this emotional shit that I've been talking about is important and you have a very tightly regimented life and you're like, I gotta fucking do all this shit because it's my goals, then you can still program all this stuff. Like program time to meditate, program time to journal. 15-minute journal, 15-minute meditate. You got 96 blocks of 15 minutes every day, 24 times 4, that's 96. You can spend one of them meditating and it has huge implications. It improves your sleep. And I just talked about how sleep improves everything else. I have a thing that nothing should interfere with sleep. So I guess going back to the entrepreneur, the Tommy Tough Guy mentality, or Tammy Tough Girl, whatever, that the undying striving for perfection is something that it's a useful American trait, but I think it's outdated and it's oftentimes harmful because of the effect on self-worth, which I might be called a pussy, but I don't really give a shit. I'm the one on the podcast talking about how vulnerable I am. I don't have shit to prove anymore because there's a lot of people that talk about masculinity and toughness regularly in their social media, and they get a following because of it. And I've even seen people comment in like Sturgill's comments about ridiculous Dick Daddy posts, and they'll be like, "Oh, that's not very masculine," or something like that. Like, I understand because I've kind of been there. I was 20 once also, but like, I don't have shit to prove. I literally don't have balls. So like, and like, I'm covered in scars, and for some reason I'm still alive. So I certainly don't have shit to prove as an individual. But I hope that like learning that from myself and you listening to it, whoever you are, gives you the idea that you can accept that you don't have to try and achieve like some standard of toughness all the time, because what does it get you? I guess we'll move on. All right, so the next question is, what are your non-negotiables when it comes to your routine, like working out, mental health, etc.? So again, like my non-negotiable, if I'm doing my shit right, should be like accepting myself and loving myself. So kind of waking up with that like I'm worthy mentality. And I keep like reiterating and repeating a lot of the same shit because so many times I teach for, that's like part of my job. And so reiteration and repetition are ways that you can remember certain things. So I hope, it's probably annoying, but you're going to remember it, and that's why I think it's valuable. Like when I teach trauma medicine, there's this protocol called the MARCH protocol: massive hemorrhage, airway, respiratory, circulation, hypothermia, and head injury. That's what that stands for. So the reason we make that protocol is because someone can remember, oh, March, I march in the military. I can remember that. And then they can like think through like, oh, massive hemorrhage. What do I need to do? Oh, look around for major blood. If it's there, okay, tourniquet, high and tight. So like I have these like things when you teach something that you repeat them and you like chunk them and then repeat them. So that's why I'm doing it, because I do the same thing for other things. But so again, self-worth is like that acceptance of like, I'm worthy, even if I don't do shit today on this quarantine bullshit. Like it's a weird thing in the world. It's bullshit, but we can't do anything about it. So instead of complaining about it, we can be like, all right, whatever I do today, I'm still worthy of my own love. I'm still worthy. Boom. So that's kind of my non-negotiable. But for me, in a ideal day, I'm gonna wake up, I make some coffee, and then I'll journal. I like to journal when it's quiet. Like if I'm at my house, then I got a nice view of the mountains. Right now it's snowing actually during the day, but I like to journal, and I work through some things. And right now, my thing is really hitting up on the what do I like about myself and why. And then I'm trying to add in like what I'm grateful for. Sometimes I run out of time because I essentially kind of will go on these like essays or rants in my journaling, and it kind of, but I always come back and I try to end it with an NVC. So anyway, journaling. I don't really hold it against myself if I don't meditate because I don't have a streak going on my app, but I would like to meditate every day. And then I'd like to work out like once every 2 or 3 days, do like a assault bike, and whether I'm nasal breathing and doing it or doing 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off and nasal breathing on the rest. Usually I ride in that thing for like 20, 30 minutes. It's really the only cardio I can do because I can't really walk. I don't run yet. And then I'll usually do some compound push-pull. It's either horizontal or vertical, and then I'll usually do some sort of RDL deadlift variant or kettlebell swings. So like the exercising once every few days. But the upkeep on my emotions is where my quote-unquote non-negotiables come in. So that's working on those things. And if I'm in a rut, then I know I got to do more of those things. I can feel sometimes if I don't know, play too much Call of Duty, then things are like spinning in my head. I kind of feel frazzled, and I'm like, I got to meditate. So once you start identifying your feelings and needs, and you can identify what you need, if rest is one of those things you routinely need because you have to get up early for work and you have a bunch of shit you're trying to do, and then you stay up too late because you're dicking around on your phone or you're watching the goddamn Tiger King all the time, then you can, if you see rest coming up as one of your needs because you're doing NVC regularly, even if you don't even journal, and you look at the list, I feel blank, I need blank, and you see rest, you'd be like, oh shit, I need to rest, so I should go to bed like an hour earlier than I normally do. So that can kind of guide you. So your non-negotiables are different than mine, and you can identify them with deliberate introspection. Next question. If everyone is going through shit, how do you take care of yourself and them? It's kind of this, I've heard this question different ways, like, how can you care for the emotional well-being of people that you're responsible for, like a kid or other family members or a spouse or a relationship, and also care for yourself? And Jesus, I don't have any kids. I'm not a parent. Go to Brene Brown's podcast because she has some interesting aspects of this. But I would say that if you don't have time for yourself, then you get into a bind. So the Merovingian in The Matrix Reloaded was like, if you don't ever take time, how can you ever have time? I don't know why my impression was like Asian or Oriental, but anyway, if you don't ever take time, how can you ever have time? I don't have any fucking time. Like, it's usually a time management thing, which I don't like doing personally. I just like kind of flowing with my day, and I have the luxury to do that because I don't really have any job obligations. So I got a lot of time to like sit, write, think, meditate, yoga, etc. But I would make an argument that some of those self-care things need to happen if you're going to be able to show up for other people. Because if you're crushed because you're not taking care of the self, then you can't be there for other people. Accepting yourself or loving the self or caring for the self gives you the freedom to open that up to other people, because I feel like a visceral difference in when I do those things, and then I can be there for other people better. Because if I'm struggling, I'm fucking super anxious, and then the person that I'm in a relationship with is like having a bad time, or they need me, and I'm just super anxious, I can't fully be there for them. So if I'm not doing the stuff for me, then I can't do the stuff. I can't do anything for anybody else, which I really like doing. But the important key is don't wait till the fucking what's a good analogy? Don't wait for the pot to boil over, or like don't wait for I don't know, I got nothing. But don't wait for shit to hit the fan. You want to get that shit before it ever touches the fan, and you want to like maybe clean that shit out over time. In other words, do your emotional self-care, do your self-compassion activities that you've identified are useful for yourself on a regular basis. And so if you get into a period where you're not doing them for like a week, 10 days, 14 days or whatever, then you're in a dip. And when you're in that emotional negative state and you're downward spiraling, it's very difficult to just like, you don't really have like a sling load to just yank you out of it. You have to then start you have to do deliberate work to get yourself out of it. So I guess the best answer to your question is to be consistent with yourself. Because even if it's just a little bit every day, or it's like a 5-minute meditation instead of a 15, or it's a quick journal exercise instead of like an open-ended journaling for 30 to 60 minutes. If all you got is a few minutes, you have to do something for the self, because then that lets you show up for others. And it's interesting because the next question is, what are strategies to help with consistency for emotional well-being, which was just my argument. And I mean, it's just like with consistency with anything else. Okay, here's a great analogy I thought of yesterday. If you know that your oil needs changed in your truck and you keep driving and you know it's changed and you drive it so much that then you have a fucking engine failure as a result of like that oil not being changed, then you knew what the problem was when that fucking meltdown happened. So if you can identify the things that prevent the meltdown, then you can do your normal maintenance. You can change that oil, and then that'll prevent the fucking engine from blowing up. So whatever your strategy is based on all the shit that I've been talking about, then you just work on the best you can, the consistency in doing so. And some of that can resonate in just your day-to-day thoughts, but I think some of this deliberate practice, this cultivation, once it gets to be a regular thing, then the thoughts start cascading in a positive direction too. So hopefully that wasn't like a non-answer, but you gotta figure it out, and you gotta work. You gotta do it. Which is funny because I'm like, don't listen to people just say do all your shit, but like, just find the time, or like the Merovingian, make the time, because if it's important, because if it prevents a meltdown, then it's important. And so it's already validated in your mind, like this is something that is useful for me. And instead of like I need to do this, I should do it, the fact that I'm not doing it makes me a piece of shit. Like you can like mitigate all those feelings, and usually like journaling about how you feel can explore those things and kind of prevent the negative things from building up. So just finding what's valuable to you, and then trying to work on it on a regular basis. Because I don't want to speak for everybody, but you might have the time to do it right now. It's just kind of like doing it. Like the hardest part is getting to a gym, which I know is ironic because you can't go to a gym, but is the ironic part, or the hardest part, is trying to start an activity. And once you get going, it's usually not that hard. Next question is, how do you live with a traumatic event from the past? How do you accept it? I debated like not even including this one because it's heavy. Like as I'm sitting here, I just remembered what it was like. I felt like I was lifted off the ground and kind of twisted when I stepped on the bomb. It blew my left leg off, and the right one was still there. And then I ended up on my back slightly downhill, and people saw this happen. So I'm thinking about it right now. And I haven't done any like deliberate trauma work with someone, with like a therapist. I have done some of that exposure stuff on my own, which I would not recommend anybody. Not because I had a good outcome from it, but I'm also like a sociopath. I don't know, like things. I'll dive into things that might seem scary just because that's what I do. But so my overall recommendation is finding someone to. I've had friends that have done psychodrama in group settings with great effect. There's like EMDR. There's other like trauma-based things with research-backed techniques that a therapist can implement. I think the theme here is like having a therapist, and how do I accept my trauma? Like I don't have a choice. I think. How do you live with things in the past, especially when it's emotional related, like it is for me? How do you accept it? You have to do for me, I have to do the work regularly, because if I don't, then things start to burn. Like that coal starts to burn on the shelf, and that's where it gets problematic. So I have to do the work regularly, and I know I need to. And if I had a job I would manipulate my situation to try and make it so that I could do the work on myself, because that's what's most important for me. And whether or not that's the most important thing for you is up to you to decide. How did I allow myself to open up to vulnerability is the next question. I didn't have a choice. Like when you're in a hospital bed, you have to have people help you. I never asked for help. So yeah, it's just inherent when you don't have legs or you got a epidural in. I had 3 epidurals. 2 of them failed. The third one didn't really work. They would fuck up all the time. Like, so I'd have these intense pain crises, all the time. And learning how to ask for help is difficult, especially in this job. That's inherently not what we do. We're inherently alone and unafraid in enemy territory, trying to use whatever we carry on our backs to accomplish a fucking mission of overthrowing an oppressive government in the name of freedom. That's like the premise of my fucking job. So like, we are going to try and figure out what we have on us or what we can acquire to accomplish a mission. So inherently, we don't ask for help, and that's maybe an extreme, but it's a representation of society. So it's like, if you learn to understand and then follow on accept fear, shame, and vulnerability, then you can communicate those things and have the courage to communicate them, and then you can cultivate that connection, which allows a safe place with an individual or a group of people to express vulnerability. Next question is, what suggestions do you have on keeping an emotional health set as a priority? I think we kind of talked about that. You find out what you got to do and do it, but don't beat yourself up. Don't beat yourself up. Beat yourself up if you don't do it. Let's see, next one. If you're going to heal an emotional wound, do you have to remember everything about a trauma? That's also one of those heavy ones because I can't speak for other trauma. I remember my shit. It's fucking blast, machine gun, dying, blast, machine gun, dying, blast, machine gun, dying, blast, and it goes like that. There's a machine gun like 8 feet away shooting back. Rounds were hitting like 10 meters away. So people tell me. I had a different perception of things. My memory repackaged the event in an interesting way. So for me, I remember grabbing someone's hand and giving that, like, I'm going to die, tell this person this. So do you have to remember? I don't know. I'm not a trauma therapist, so find a trauma therapist. I would imagine that the exposure helps, from what little I know about exposure therapy. But it's also understanding the implications the event has on you. And that's best done with traumatic events with a therapist. On a lighter note, did Randy the Snake go with you overseas? I can't comment on what Randy the Snake does or doesn't do. He's his own person. If you don't know, if you don't know what I'm talking about, then go on the Instagram page. It's like @justin.lascek, and you'll see my friend Randy the Snake talking a little bit about the old nonsense dick daddy stuff that Sturgill's all about right now. But I don't know. He's his own man. Randy's his own guy. He does what he wants. He's like, he's kind of like a panther. Like, he'll come around if he wants to, but if you don't want to, he won't come. You know what I mean? So, someone's asking, how have you found your new normal? And that can be interpreted multiple ways, but my new normal, like compared to 14 months ago, is completely ass different because this shit sucks. I don't have legs, so if I'm on the couch and they're off and I gotta piss really bad, then I have to put them on. And then there's nerve pain, there's discomfort, just from the legs. And there are a lot of amputees, and maybe I'm bitching, but I mean, if you're an amputee, it sucks. And if you are an amputee, you know what I'm talking about. It does suck, but we can deal with it. And some of you deal with it really well. I don't know if some of you compartmentalize. I don't know. It's tough. And then, not having testicles or the male hormone of testosterone, it sucks. Even though I can take it, it has other reverberations potentially on my long-term health. So my new normal is really weird, but I've kind of found, I think every month I have an improvement, and I think that improvement is predicated on doing the work on the self, and then as that like little parenthetical phrase that tagged onto it, like, but not blaming the self if I'm not getting shit done. But I know that because I'm evaluating so often in journaling, that if I've slipped on accomplishing, or if I've slipped on like doing the self-care, then I might have symptoms develop of things happening in my emotional health. So for me, I know what I need to do, and that's my focus, to the point where I've gotten to influence my work situation to have no work. So I don't have any obligations, which I'm incredibly grateful for, in order to work on the self. And so people have enabled that, and there are certain types of people that are there for me, and I appreciate them and I'm grateful for it, whether it's a professional, personal, or otherwise. And so my new normal is trying to work on this emotional health thing, and also finding ways that I can influence things to be better, or people to work on themselves, give them tools and help. That's what I care about. We just have a few more questions. If you're still sticking around on this little podcast, then rock and roll. But the next question is, how can I stay away from alcohol during quarantine? And look, so if you accept the whole paradigm earlier that certain behaviors will numb negative emotions, and you accept that as the foundation of like an emotional health model, or that's like part of the model, then alcohol might be that thing that you're using to numb. Whether it's just like pure fucking boredom, or the boredom is there, the perceived boredom, because it's like, oh, I have all this time, and then you're thinking about the negative aspects of yourself. So you're like, well, I'm going to fucking have a good time then. And then you drink to induce that state. Personally, I don't drink alcohol anymore. Someone asked me what my favorite drink is. I guess like a whiskey or a red wine. If I have it, it's like one glass. But I don't drink alcohol anymore because it's literally a poison. It shuts down the prefrontal cortex, so it prevents REM sleep. And REM sleep is incredibly important for memory, hormonal release, like recovery. It's the time period during sleep that reduces inflammation in the brain. So as you walk around and your normal metabolic function in your brain occurs, you essentially have these things in it that are, I'm just summing up as inflammation. And so having the appropriate amount of REM sleep is something that it clears out that inflammation. So I don't mess with alcohol. I track my sleep with the Oura Ring, O-U-R-A. It's like the Swedish thing. It shows you heart rate variability, REM sleep. Won't get into it now because that'll be like another half hour, but I track my sleep all the time, so I see what I do and don't do well, and then I see how it affects my sleep. And if I have like 2 drinks of alcohol, then it fucks it up really bad. And the REM sleep occurs in the second half of the night, and if you go to bed late and then you're getting woken up by a certain time, you're not getting your full sleep window, then you're not getting that REM sleep. And then even if you're not sleeping within the context of your circadian rhythm, you won't appropriately get REM sleep. So if you're like drinking regularly, you're drinking like a little bit every night, then you're just like chronically undersleeping, which is it's like horrible, and it's going to make everything worse. So if you have if you think that you're like fit into this, like the need for emotional improvement, which I think most people can improve their emotional health, which is why I'm here. But if you think you have I hesitate to say problem, but if you have like if you struggle with emotional health, then alcohol is going to be the fucking opposite of what you need. But how can you stay away from it in general? Like, like, in my opinion, if you're doing it in order to numb negative behaviors, then you need to explore those negative behaviors. And so I'm repeating myself again. Explore those negative behaviors so you can understand them, accept those fears, shame, and vulnerability is just part of who you are, your imperfect self. And it goes within the mindset that, like, I am imperfect and I accept that. That's okay. This moment right now is imperfect, but that's what makes it perfect. It makes it this beautiful thing that is never going to happen again. And so live in the moment. That the whole mentality can apply to this emotional health, that I need to, I accept all these things about myself that I may not enjoy or like or something. Like, it's okay. So I think that that's the real thing. And if you're covering it up and thinking that you're just drinking a lot of alcohol just because you're fucking bored or you're just like home, then maybe you haven't done that whole deliberate introspection thing to understand what the alcohol may or may not be doing. It's not like you're doing a bad thing. It just might be like numbing, and it's not going to help. So you can do things that can help the emotional state. And then, like, it doesn't hurt to like drink anyway. It's just like, if you want to have a good time, or you want to have like a little bit of a lubricant good time, that's no pun. But if you're just trying to like get silly, or you're going to play video games with your friends, you want to participate in alcohol, then whatever. But if it's like this everyday thing and like you're doing it because you feel bad about yourself, then that's what this whole episode is about. And then, by the way, I'm prescribed Marinol which is a synthetic THC. And basically, if alcohol is poison and this other thing is not, and you can get like silly with that, then, choose your own adventure. The last thing, and I think it's kind of a good summary for this whole dealio, is how can you be vulnerable and stay tough? And that was like, I talked about that in the intro. Like, how do I bridge the opposing mentalities of mental toughness and being cool and being someone that, like, if you're here because you're here for the combat and you're here for the special forces and you're here for like the cool shit, and like RPGs flying a foot over my head, me almost dying several days in a row, like firefights of like calling in mortars and shit, like doing smoke screens and riding on a razor on the side of a razor back to an outpost. Like, if you're here for that shit, then like you're here for the mental toughness stuff. You're just like, that's fucking cool shit. But if you're here for that, hopefully you got something out of the other side of the argument, which is like the vulnerable or the compassion, what I'm going to call compassionate side of things. Because I don't know how, but like what I would like to do, and hopefully what I'm doing, is bridging the gap between these things. Some of you may not want to listen to Brene Brown talk to Glennon Davis. If I'm messing her last name up, my bad. Her first name's Glennon. Like, I want to support like a feminist movement. I want to support like racial equality or like equality for all people. Like, these are things that I care about because I feel like I'm a humanist. And I don't know if some of you are against those things or kind of find them weird or off-putting or like emasculating or something like that. Hopefully I'm bridging the gap and just making you like think about it. You can definitely fucking disagree with me, and you should critically think about everything I'm saying. And if you choose to implement the things that I'm talking about, then you will find out for yourself if they are beneficial or not. And if they're not, then you can like message me and we can see if there's a problem with the tactics or the way that the tools are being used. Instead of like beating yourself up and journaling, then, what are you grateful for and why is like an example of that. So I think that there are times you got to be tough, but you don't have to be dumb and tough. Like, if I'm at work, if I didn't get fucking blown up and I was still functioning a day-to-day as a Green Beret, right now is different because of COVID. But if guys were preparing for deployment, like you gotta be tough in your job. You gotta function properly. But when you leave that job or you go back in the team room and you're not in the middle of doing small unit tactics or flat range or breaching or whatever the training is for the day, and you have something that you're dealing with, then hopefully you have that leadership person like I do, who's a good friend of mine that I care about greatly and who put tourniquets on me, and that person would listen to something that I was dealing with. And I hope that you have that type of person. But that's what I think that the culture of, whether we're talking about special operations or society, the culture of improving people's compassion and their critical thinking will allow the delicate dance of vulnerability and toughness. Because there has to be toughness for some things, but we don't have to make things tougher than they need to be. Like, do we need to do stupid shit at work that's like getting in the way of productivity? Like, once this COVID thing is over, do we need people to come into the office 5 days a week? Are they accomplishing the same shit if they don't come one of those days or two of those days? I don't know. Just some like hypothetical thoughts. So mental toughness is important. Developing it is beneficial. But I think where the flaw in what I did as a kid, becoming a person and trying to be a man, is that I perceived it to be, I had this archetype of what a Green Beret was, or a CAG operator, which is the Delta Force. And he was like this cool under pressure, could do anything in any kind of worst case scenario, emotional control, can fucking take care of anything, isn't significantly harmed by the things that he can do to the bad guys, which that's not something I deal with, is like killing bad guys. That doesn't bother me. It bothers some people, but that's fine. But that's okay. But like, for example, that doesn't bother me. So, I don't know. Is that a representation of like, I'm able to be vulnerable, but be tough? I have no idea, but that's what I'm trying to do. And I think that's what we're doing together. So I hope that this episode was something that stimulated your thought process on emotional well-being. Because as a man or as a woman or anything in between, I think having compassion and critical thinking is going to be the way forward. And toughness is part of that, but it's not the only game. And deflecting everything, wearing armor and deflecting and numbing all of your behaviors is not what leads to compassion. That's not even what toughness is. That's just creating a shell, and that person wearing that armor is not available for themselves or anybody else. And if we had a lot of people that were available for themselves, it might not be so bad of a place. So I appreciate you listening to the Justin Lascek podcast. Go out there, put one foot in front of the other, even if you ain't got any.